Britain is changing, quietly, politely, and through the official channels. In other words, in a very British way. But make no mistake, what is happening in Westminster right now is not business as usual. It is a public backlash against a political system many people believe ignored serious problems for years and told ordinary citizens not to ask difficult questions. For a long time, issues such as unofficial religious courts, marriages not registered with the state, and grooming gang scandals were treated as topics people were not supposed to discuss openly. Anyone who raised concerns risked being called a bigot, or worse. That atmosphere is now changing. Officials who avoided these questions for years are now being questioned under oath. Hundreds of grooming cases that were previously shelved are being reviewed again. Reform UK, a party that was barely a major force a few years ago, has surged in the polls and won councils that had been controlled by the same parties for decades. On doorstep after doorstep, many voters are sending the same message. They want one legal system, equal treatment, and an end to separate rules operating inside British society. This is not just a passing mood. It is a country taking a hard look at itself and deciding that something has gone badly wrong. And the rest of Europe is watching closely, because if Britain cannot resolve this tension, many are asking who can. To understand how Britain reached this point, you have to go back to the basic promise on which the modern British state was built. Follow the law, and the law will protect you. For centuries, that meant the same rules applied to everyone, rich or poor, born in Britain or newly arrived. Same rights, same protections, same courts, one law for all. That was not just a slogan. It was the foundation of the country. But over time, that foundation began to face pressure. Large numbers of people arrived from different parts of the world, including Muslim-majority countries, bringing with them customs and traditions that did not always fit neatly within British law. These included religious councils, unregistered marriages, and family disputes handled outside the official court system. For decades, politicians largely avoided the issue. Britain had welcomed waves of immigrants before. Irish, Caribbean, South Asian, East African, Polish, and many others. In many cases, the pattern was straightforward. People arrived, worked, raised families, and their children grew up British. The national bargain held. But the question of parallel rules was different. The concern was not immigration as a whole. It was whether unofficial systems were being allowed to develop alongside British law. Religious councils, marriages not recognized by the state, and traditions from overseas were becoming part of life in some communities, while politicians refused to have an honest debate about what that meant. For years, anyone who asked whether these practices were compatible with British law was shouted down. The debate was closed before it could begin. Meanwhile, those parallel systems continued to grow. The numbers tell part of the story. The UK has around 69 million people. Around 3.9 million are Muslim, making up about 6.5% of the population in England and Wales, up from under 5% a decade earlier. In some areas, the percentage is much higher. Tower Hamlets is nearly 40% Muslim. Birmingham and Bradford are around 30%. Those numbers alone are not the issue. The bigger question is what kinds of institutions and customs have developed alongside them. Across England and Wales, estimates suggest there are between 30 and 85 Sharia councils operating inside Muslim communities. No one knows the exact number because the government has never properly counted them. Officially, these councils have no legal power. They cannot imprison anyone. They cannot force people to obey them. On paper, they are simply advisory bodies. But in practice, they can carry enormous influence. They deal with marriage, divorce, and family disputes. In close-knit communities, their decisions can carry more weight than a British court, especially for people under strong family or social pressure. Yet, these councils are not regulated like courts, and the government does not routinely monitor their decisions. That raises a serious question about one of Britain's core principles, one law for all. The problem becomes especially serious when it comes to marriage and divorce. A government review in 2018 found that the vast majority of people using these councils were women, and most were seeking religious divorces. Why were they there? Because many Muslim marriages in the UK are religious ceremonies only and are not registered with the British state, in religious terms, the couple may be considered married. In legal terms, they are not. That can leave women in a very difficult position. If the marriage breaks down, they may have no legal claim to property, no automatic financial protection, and no route through the British divorce system. To leave the marriage in the eyes of their community, they may need a religious decree. If a council refuses, or if a husband delays the process, the woman can be left trapped. Women's rights groups call this marital captivity. It is not just a dramatic phrase. It describes a real problem faced by women who are legally invisible within the system. The 2018 review recommended several reforms, including oversight of Sharia councils. The government accepted some recommendations but rejected the most important one, creating a formal watchdog. The concern was that regulating the councils might make them look more official. So, in practice, very little changed. Marriage reform stalled. Awareness campaigns did not materialize in any meaningful way. The councils continued operating. Unregistered marriages continued. And women caught between religious expectations and British law continued to fall through the cracks. The public was never really asked whether it accepted this situation. It was simply expected to tolerate it. Then polling showed just how far public opinion had moved. A major YouGov poll commissioned by a women's rights group found that 59% of UK adults supported banning Sharia courts outright. 84% said no part of British law should be replaced by Sharia. 66% said Sharia law does not respect women's rights, while only 3% said it does. That is not a fringe opinion. It is a broad national consensus that politicians had ignored for years. Once those numbers became public, Westminster could no longer pretend the issue did not exist. Many voters were no longer willing to accept separate legal systems, and they were no longer willing to be told that merely raising the question was racist. And then came the issue that cut even deeper, the grooming gang scandals. For years, towns such as Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham, and Telford became symbols of institutional failure. Children were abused while councils, police forces, and social workers failed to act properly. In some cases, officials appeared more worried about reputational damage or accusations of racism than about protecting vulnerable girls. For much of the 2000s, there was one topic many officials were afraid to address openly: the fact that if we didn't know what the efforts of the military were likely to address openly, then we'll come from a pain when we lie. The pattern appeared in files and investigations. But saying it out loud could damage a career. Officials who raised the issue risked being branded racist or Islamophobic. As a result, some police forces stopped recording ethnicity properly. Councils softened their language. Social workers were warned to be careful about identifying patterns. Whistleblowers were sidelined. Victims were ignored or dismissed. In Rotherham alone, a 2014 report found that around 1,400 children had been sexually exploited over 16 years in a town of about 260,000 people. That number shocked the country. But what shocked people even more was the sense that institutions had spent years avoiding the most uncomfortable questions. The original crimes were committed by individuals, but the deeper breach of trust came from the belief that people in authority had failed to protect children because they were afraid of political consequences. That failure exploded back into public debate when Baroness Louise Casey published a major report on grooming gangs in England and Wales. Casey is often brought in when governments need someone to examine serious institutional failure. She had already investigated Rotherham. This time, she was asked to answer the question Westminster had avoided for years. Her findings were blunt. She described blindness, ignorance, and prejudice as factors that had caused repeated failures. Officials had avoided the ethnicity question for so long that they created a gap in understanding, and abusers exploited that gap. Local data from areas including Manchester, West Yorkshire, and South Yorkshire showed that men of Pakistani heritage were overrepresented in some grooming gang cases. For years, that data had often been dismissed or avoided. Casey pointed out the circular logic. Officials failed to collect proper data, then used the lack of data to claim there was no problem. Her most important line was simple: it is not racist to examine the ethnicity of offenders. For years, many people in power had refused to say that. Casey put it in writing and placed it before Parliament. She made 12 recommendations. The government accepted all of them. The Home Secretary acknowledged that the British state had failed in one of its most basic duties, protecting children. This was a major political turning point. The data was public. The towns were named. The years of denial were named. There was no easy way to move past it. But Casey's report was only the beginning. The government then moved toward a full national inquiry, led by a former children's commissioner known for being tough and independent. The inquiry was given major funding, a 3-year timeline, and the power to compel witnesses and demand documents. Crucially, the inquiry's mandate to examine previously taboo factors. Inquiries cannot suffer from the inquiries cannot control a factor. Prominent people for reasons that fall from 2 projected ways of change. That means local authorities can no longer simply refuse to engage with the issue. At the same time, the National Crime Agency began reviewing grooming gang cases across the country. Hundreds of cold cases were pulled back for review, with officials suggesting the final number could exceed 1,000. Cases that had been dropped years earlier are being reopened. Victims who were ignored may finally be heard. Officers and officials who closed files will now face questions about why they did so. The law is also changing. One of Casey's key recommendations was that any adult who has sex with a child under 16 should face the most serious charge possible. No more downgrading. No more language that suggests a child could meaningfully consent. Parliament agreed to reforms. New rules are being introduced to make it a crime for professionals such as teachers, social workers, and police officers to notice child abuse and stay silent. Sentencing is being toughened. Recording offender ethnicity, once treated by some institutions as too sensitive to touch, is now becoming part of the official process. That is what it looks like when a system finally stops avoiding the issue. There is now a national inquiry, a national criminal operation, legal reform, and new reporting rules, all happening at once. But politicians did not move because they suddenly changed their minds. They moved because voters were moving faster than Westminster expected. By 2026, Reform UK had surged to the top of national polling, ahead of both Labour and the Conservatives. In local elections, the party won councils outright and broke decades of Labour control in places such as Sandwell. It also made major gains in areas that had long been fought over by Labour and the Conservatives. These were not small shifts. In some places, voters completely redrew the political map. The Labour government soon found itself in crisis. MPs began openly calling for the Prime Minister to resign. Ministers and aides reportedly lost confidence. They wanted to resign, and residents they wanted to discuss the Prime Minister to resign. Ministers and aides reportedly lost confidence because they couldn't tell the Conservative freedom. The political class that had spent years warning voters away from these topics was now facing the consequences at the ballot box. And grooming gangs and Sharia councils were not the only issues driving public anger. The asylum hotel system had also become a major flashpoint. The cost to taxpayers had climbed into the billions. The asylum appeal backlog had grown sharply. More than 100,000 people applied for asylum in a single year. Then came the case in Epping, where an asylum seeker who had recently arrived by boat was charged with sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. He was later convicted and sentenced to 12 months. The case triggered furious protests. The Bell Hotel in Epping became a national symbol of public anger. Many residents felt the system was protecting newly arrived asylum seekers while failing to protect local communities. Some protests attracted far-right groups, but many people involved were ordinary residents who felt ignored and abandoned. The courts eventually allowed the hotel to continue housing asylum seekers despite opposition from the local council. The government said asylum hotels would be closed by 2029, but for many voters, that timeline was far too slow. Mainstream parties have now noticed the shift. Conservatives have hardened their position on borders. Labour, while in government, is trying to sound tougher on enforcement without alienating its own left wing. Politicians who once dismissed these concerns as racist are now campaigning on promises to regain control. The boundaries of acceptable debate have changed, not because politicians moved them, but because voters forced them to move. Then another major argument arrived: Free speech. The government introduced a new definition of anti-Muslim hostility, saying it was needed because hate crimes against Muslims had risen significantly. Ministers argued that the state had a duty to protect people from violence, harassment, and prejudice. The definition stated that criticism, debate, and ridicule of religious ideas would remain legal. The government insisted it was not trying to limit open discussion. Critics were not convinced. Free speech campaigners warned that a state-backed definition could be used to shut down exactly the kind of debate Britain now needs to have about religious councils, unregistered marriages, grooming gang failures, integration, and the relationship between community practices and national law. The central question is whether the state can protect people from hatred without protecting ideas from criticism. That is now one of the biggest free speech battles in British public life. So where does this leave Britain? The country is not trying to destroy its history. Many voters believe it is trying to recover it. For centuries, Britain's system rested on a simple idea: one law for everyone. That principle helped build trust in the courts, protect individual rights, and create a society where people from many backgrounds could live under the same rules. That principle is now being tested. Parallel systems, unofficial councils, unregistered marriages, institutional cover-ups, and weak enforcement have all placed strain on the national bargain. Many voters now believe that tolerance cannot mean allowing separate rules to operate beyond public scrutiny. Yet Britain's institutions still exist. The courts still function. Elections still happen. The public still has the power to force change. What has changed is the mood underneath. Voters who stayed quiet for years are no longer quiet. They are demanding answers, accountability, and a return to equal treatment under the law. Cold cases are being reopened. Ethnicity data is being collected. Mandatory reporting rules are being introduced. A national inquiry is taking evidence. Public opinion has shifted. The free speech debate is intensifying. None of this was true just a short time ago. Now it is all happening at once. Europe is watching because many countries face similar pressures. Questions of integration, national law, religious identity, immigration, public safety, and trust in institutions. The Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, Belgium, Austria, and Denmark are all dealing with versions of the same debate. Britain's challenge is whether it can restore confidence in one shared legal system without turning against law-abiding citizens from minority communities. The issue is not whether Britain should become intolerant. The issue is whether tolerance can survive without fairness, honesty, and equal protection under the law. Politicians who spent years saying these questions could not be asked are now learning that voters will ask them anyway, in polls, in protests, and at the ballot box. The real question is whether Britain has acted too late, or whether this is the moment it begins to put things right. Will the inquiry hold officials, counselors, police leaders, and institutions accountable for failures that allowed children to be abused? Will reopened investigations lead to real consequences? Will women trapped in unregistered marriages finally receive proper legal protection? Will Britain defend free speech while also protecting people from genuine hatred? Those are the questions now facing the country. And the answer will shape not only Britain's future, but the future of every Western country watching the same tensions grow at home.